Plato believed that the perfect city would take the form of a circle. In his work, The Critias, he first wrote about the mythical city of Atlantis and described the capital as composed of concentric circles surrounding a majestic palace. Every ring in the circle was connected by magnificent bridges and grand canals. We often associate perfection with symmetry, and what's more symmetrical than a circle? But what about the circle is so special, and why must perfection be round? Well, throughout history, there have been real life examples of circular cities. For example, the round city of Baghdad, also known as the City of Peace. Built around 760 CE, its perfectly symmetrical shape symbolized its importance as a central hub for culture, knowledge, and power. However, more contemporarily, we have a place like Rotonda West, a planned residential community in Florida that was built as a perfect circle, supposedly inspired by Disney's City of Tomorrow. Its circular design encourages efficiency and interconnectivity. And in the world of fiction, we still see circular cities being created, like the city in Attack on Titan. Its circular design and massive dividing walls serve as both a means for protection and control. However, the city I want to talk about in this video is perhaps the roundest, most circular city of them all, Lumiose, as featured in Pokemon Legends ZA. You see, what I found interesting about the map of this game is that it is a perfect circle. Most video game maps are weird shapes, and even ones that include cities are usually made up of collections of trapezoids. Many video game maps do approximate circles, as in there is a central landmark with land that radiates outward, but rarely are these maps perfectly circular. So the design of a perfectly circular city is somewhat unique for a video game map. Design-wise, what does this do? Well, it makes navigation feel a little more natural and intuitive. You have a central landmark, that being the middle of the map, Lumiose Tower, which serves as a reference point for any direction you might go. There's also an obvious and clear distinction between the center and the edges, which narratively shows a difference of importance. Clearly, the center is where the important stuff is going to happen, and this builds a tension and suspense that I think works well for this game and its ultimate payoff in the end, when the under construction Lumiose Tower is finally revealed. And while narratively this works well in terms of visually communicating to the player the importance of Lumiose Tower, I think it falls a bit flat in the post-game content. After completing the story, the area does just become another wild zone. I do wish instead you were actually able to go up the tower and get a high scenic view of the entire city, which I think would have made for a significant moment and a nice reward for beating the game. But why is the city a perfect circle? Rarely are cities in real life perfectly circular, and this is because cities don't necessarily grow uniformly. They naturally take on shapes that serve a more functional purpose. Even in nature, finding a perfect circle is fairly rare. But this departure from the natural order is what makes the design of Lumiose City so significant. The city isn't unnatural, not just in terms of it being man-made, but even its perfectly circular shape isn't normal in reference to other cities. I think from a thematic point of view, this supports the idea that there is a rift between people and Pokemon. A big part of ZA's plot is the feral Pokemon and the inclusion of more and more wild zones to appease that. The wild zones begin to take over, showing that even an artificial city represented by a perfect circle cannot inhibit the pull of nature. But the design of this circular city is also a bit of a departure from the usual gameplay progression in most Pokemon games. Usually you journey in a linear direction, with opponents getting stronger the closer you get to the end. But in this case, that linearity is gone. Reaching the center isn't necessarily associated with more challenge, and with such a small map, creating a sense of progressing difficulty with location wouldn't go too well either, as you'll often visit the same areas multiple times. So instead, the game has the ZA Royale, where difficulty increases as you rank up. The city and the places you go don't really change, but the intensity of your opponents does with your rank. The thing is, Z to A is a straightforward path, Z being the weakest and A being the strongest, and circles aren't really straightforward. So with the game having such an emphasis on the idea of the circle, there must be more to it. And I think that there is. You see, you start at rank Z and achieve rank A when you become the strongest. But through the events of the game's story, you also gain the respect of a legendary Pokemon called Zygarde, a legendary Pokemon associated with that last letter of the alphabet, Z. Zygarde is an extremely powerful Pokemon and is by far the strongest, at least narratively, in the game. You are only able to capture Zygarde after you've achieved rank A. So by getting a Pokemon associated with the letter Z who is the strongest after rising from rank Z, the weakest rank, it completes the loop and reinforces that idea of the circle. But speaking of circles and loops, I have to talk about Revolution. Circles are also pretty well known for their ability to spin and roll, and so circles can revolve like wheels, which are also obviously circular. They follow cyclical paths and are symbolically associated with change. What goes on top goes to the bottom, and vice versa. And so, speaking of change and revolutions, I want to talk about one of history's most well known ones, the French Revolution. The French Revolution, to overly simplify, was essentially the complete flip of French society in the late 1700s. The poor commoners overthrew their current outdated social system and removed the rich noble class with extreme violence. The monarchy was abolished and people demanded equal rights and representation. However, this ultimately ended with Napoleon Bonaparte taking control of the government and establishing a military dictatorship. The connection to France in Pokemon Legends ZA is pretty obvious. Lumiose is heavily inspired by France. The foods and fashion are all very reminiscent of the country, and the Prism Tower even resembles the Eiffel Tower. But France has a deep history, as does Lumiose. When exploring the museum in Lumiose, we learn about kings and a royal family that has held power in the region for a very long time. We even have references to a more bourgeois class in the game with Jacinthe and the Society of Battle Connoisseurs, who are the more wealthy and pompous denizens of Lumiose. Even a character like AZ acts as a kind of foil to historical figures like Napoleon. Napoleon was a major figure in French history who seized power during the Revolution and sought to gain even more by conquering more of Europe. However, his lust for power ended up being his ultimate downfall when his invasion of Russia failed, leading to his exile. AZ from Legend ZA was also a ruler during a time of war, and because of the loss of his beloved Pokemon, he created the ultimate weapon, intending to revive his Pokemon at the cost of many other lives. He ended up being horrified by his actions and enacted a self-imposed exile, wandering the world as a nomad instead for many of his years. Both Napoleon and AZ are wartime rulers whose ambition led them to losing their power and ending up a shell of their former selves. In the case of Napoleon, who suffered a great loss in battle, and AZ, who suffered a great loss personally. I also find the contrast of Napoleon being famously known as a very short man and AZ, who is nearly 9 feet tall, a sort of hint to this connection. The game also takes place while Lumiose is undergoing a major redevelopment, evident by the tower at the center being under construction, just like with France undergoing major social redevelopment. And a big part of the changes in Lumiose are the introduction of wild zones, creating a more equal opportunity environment for both people and Pokemon. And this brings me back to the idea of the circle. A circle represents equality, like King Arthur's Round Table, so that all who had a seat had an equal say, and no one would be above any other person. The problem with the circle, though, is that it has a center, and a center has inherent importance. And at the center of Lumiose is the Prism Tower, which also turns out to be a weapon of great destruction, threatening the safety of the city. So we see that symbolically a circle strives for equality, although at the center, the one part that does give itself more importance threatens the very structure that allows everyone to be equal. And so to me, it kind of becomes a message about the danger of higher distinctions and how that can threaten ideals of equality. This all mirrors the French Revolution, with the distinction in the classes of people, mirrors to historical figures, and the major changes taking place to the city. And so Lumiose, like Plato's Atlantis, is the story of a fictional city, appearing as a circle in the hopes of creating an egalitarian utopia. But Atlantis is ultimately destroyed by the gods as punishment for their hubris. Lumiose in Pokemon Legends ZA is also nearly destroyed, not by the gods, but by a Pokemon approximating the power of one, and a man who wanted to cheat death. An ultimate weapon lives at the center of the city, threatening the balance of people and Pokemon. But we see this story in the real world as well. The rich and powerful of France centuries ago saw this firsthand. Their hubris ended with their head in a guillotine. But the fundamental principle of the circle persists. Cycles occur and history repeats itself. Even today, the gap between the rich and the poor grows larger and the hubris of man grows every day. And like the spokes on a wheel, the time for change gets closer with each passing moment. Perhaps we create these fictional cities to warn future generations that these cycles are inevitable. Or maybe we wish for an ideal world where we embrace the equality of the circle. Lumiose is far from an ideal world and even farther from an ideal video game map, if I'm being completely honest. But it did make me think about what a circle could really be trying to say. And so the idea of a circular city is certainly one we've been thinking about again and again, from the time of Plato to the age of Pokemon. And so, in the end, even the circle itself can't escape its cyclical nature.